Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Salt Pond Visitor Center. This afternoon we have a very special program. It's actually a program that was created. The Park Service won't take much credit for this. It was actually created as an inspiration for the town of Eastham. The town of Eastham has a 400th anniversary committee, which is focused on the upcoming 400th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims and the first encounters that followed. So today's program is Dr. Kathleen Bragdon. She's a professor of anthropology at the College of William & Mary, where I actually went to school, which is great to host some alumnus, or I'm an alumnus. In fact, I believe Kathleen's husband, I was a student in his historical archaeology class, so it all kind of has a nice little circle to it. So this afternoon we're really talking about the first encounters before the first encounter and how the native peoples who lived on Cape Cod met the 1620 Pilgrims. And Dr. Bragdon will be going into, the fact that in 1620 these were not the first encounters. There's a long history of encounters. And encounters is an interesting term to begin with as well.
That's true.
So going back 400 years is always difficult, and we tried to use different tools to figure out what life was like and what the people were like. And perhaps 400 years ago in this instance, if this was a 1,000-piece puzzle in a box, we might have 20 pieces. Maybe we have 800. Maybe we have 500. What if we had 1,000 and we knew exactly what happened? Would we really still understand what happened? So there's a lot to think about with events going back 4 centuries. So Dr. Bragdon also has a connection with Cape Cod National Seashore. She has been working on an ethnographic study which examines the native peoples of the past and the contemporary native peoples of the Mashpee tribe and the Wampanoag tribe of Gehenna-Quina, and those people's connections with the National Seashore, the land and the resources here. And so she's been collaborating with the tribes and with other researchers to fully paint the picture so that people like me, the park historian here, have a better idea of what native peoples today and what native peoples in the past, what their relationship was with the lands of the Outer Cape from Chatham to Provincetown. So we thank her for the continued work on that ethnographic study. She's also the author of many works, including Native People of Southern New England, 1650 to 1775. And so this is a book that we reference often here at the National Seashore. It gives a nice context to that history. And finally, the funding for this program and for other programs that the Eastham 400 Committee is putting on here at the National Seashore and elsewhere in town, the funding comes from the Mass Humanities, National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Massachusetts Cultural Council. So, without any further ado, Dr. Kathleen Bragdon.
Well, thank you all for being here today. Thank you to the organizers of this session, to Bill and to Deborah DeJonker-Berry, and some of the other people who I know have been working very hard behind the scenes to make this series happen. I should also thank you for being here on a beautiful day when I think both the Patriots and the Red Sox are playing. Let's hope I can make it as entertaining for you as it would be to be watching those games. The Red Sox, not so sure this year, but we live in hope. So I also want to thank the Wampanoag tribes, the Wampanoag people of this region, whose territory we are presently occupying and standing on, and whose history we celebrate. And I want to thank the Mashpee tribal members in particular, who have helped me in my research for many, many years, and also for the way that they keep forgiving me for all of my mistakes. Today, I'd like to talk about the encounters before the encounters. Everybody is familiar with the so-called Pilgrim story, although we rewrite that occasionally ourselves. And most of that story comes from a very small number of so-called original narratives from the 15th and the 16th centuries. In particular, Mort's Relation, which describes the first encounter. My husband and I just spent a few minutes at the first encounter beach trying to absorb the atmosphere of that first encounter. But we know from those early texts that the native people who were meant to be encountering the pilgrims, the new settlers, were absent from a lot of that story. They found their fires, they found their houses, they found remnants of farming, they even found some of their interments. But the people themselves were elusive in these early accounts, which has given people the impression, I think, over the past several hundred years, that the native people were few and far between, that they were scarce, even that they were absent in some cases. And this is far from the case. And to explain in a way why these early encounters were so elusive, we have to go back a little bit in time to understand the way in which native people first encountered Europeans, which happened in the perhaps as early as the Norse period, but for sure by the 15th century AD. So at least 100 years before the arrival of the pilgrims at Plymouth. And it's this story that helps us to understand the native responses to the arrival of the first settlers in the region, who came really pretty late in this history of encounters. So I'm going to be spending a little bit of time on 4 aspects of what Native Americans learned by meeting Europeans in the 15th and the 16th centuries AD, and a little bit of time talking about the 4 principal actors that we hear about in the first encounter stories. The Sachem Aspinet from this region, the Patuxet native Squanto or Tisquantum, the native Samoset, about whom not very much is known, and of course Massasoit Usamaquin, all of who appear in the earliest narratives and who turn out to be men who had a great deal of experience in working with Europeans. And we're going to learn, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about that today. So, let's see if I can get this to work. Well, we all know that there are lots of Native Americans who have been to Britain. Those of you, many of you may recognize, this is Abbey Road. And these are, in fact, a group of Cherokee men who visited there for a number of celebrations, I think connected with the Pocahontas celebrations in 2008 and 2009. So it's not a surprise that Native people have been to Europe and have been visiting Great Britain for many centuries now. This is the mother and daughter pair, the Isherwoods, who discovered in 2010 that they have native DNA. And that was discovered by a Cambridge University scholar. So it appears that the Isherwood family are descended from a native person or native persons who stayed in Britain, who stayed there after the arrival or the first encounters and somehow married into and became part of British society. So these are fun things to think about when we think about the first encounter, because we have this evidence that there are many ways in which we could understand this subject. One of the first and most obvious places to begin are the encounters that Europeans began, if you will, by the first explanation, the first explanations of the Atlantic seaboard by a number of entrepreneurs, fishing expeditions, and people who were looking perhaps to establish colonies in the area. This is an excerpt from de Blau's map from the early 17th century. We can record explorers going back at least 75 years before this map was made. And people were especially interested in the southern New England region, stretching from Narragansett, from Long Island Sound to Narragansett Bay. And then those who were brave enough to round the Cape and extend their explanations further to the north encountered other native peoples who spoke similar languages, excuse me, and who were, of course, in contact with one another during this period of exploration. So even though we tend to think of this time as a time when Europeans discovered the Americas, this was also a time when native people were discovering Europeans. One of the first individuals whose name turns up in a lot of these early exploration records is Sir Ferdinando Gorges, who had a patent for the area that includes southern Maine, and in some historians' version of this story actually had a rival claim to that of the Pilgrims in southeastern New England. He was the financier and the one of the motivators of exploration of this region beginning in the late 16th century. Interestingly, and I'm not an historian, so forgive me, I've got most of these facts wrong, I'm sure, but he was involved in the Essex plot against Queen Elizabeth in the early 17th century and somehow escaped all punishment for that, not because he himself escaped the New World, but because of his financial and other interests. Sir Ferdinando Gorges and the men who sailed for him were responsible for capturing and bringing to England a dozen or more native people who were coastal residents of the southern Maine, New Hampshire, and possibly Massachusetts Bay region of the New World, bringing them to England for the purposes of teaching them English so that they could then serve as interpreters in further expeditions to the New World. So if we want to thank anybody for the visits of native people to the New World, to the Old World, as I should say, he is one of the people that we should thank. He wrote a narrative, one of the first ones, which described native people of the region and the people who specifically worked with him in learning the language and developing knowledge of the New World in terms of navigational issues, in terms of the culture and language of the people, and various other facts that were of enormous economic importance in those days. One of his so-called savages was apparently Squanto, who was captured somewhere off the coast of New England as a young man, and depending on whose story you believe, was in Britain and in Europe at least 3 different times, somehow managed to return to the Pawtuxet area, which was his home, by the time the Pilgrims arrived in 1620. So this was a man who was quite knowledgeable about Britain and Europe, likely spoke very good English, and possibly Spanish and French as well. A very sophisticated traveler in the 17th century. Here we see the context for a lot of the first interaction between the Algonquin-speaking peoples of the Northeast and native people. This was once thought to be an image from this region, but recently scholars have argued that it probably was based on whaling expeditions in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. So I'll leave you all to decide on that. I'm not an expert on that. But in any case, it was part of these whaling and fishing expeditions where Europeans, mariners, and the people who were funding these ventures, if you will, first came into contact with one another. I just wanted to show you some other interesting facts about the native peoples who were brought to England in the early part of the 17th century. This is a screenshot, sorry it's not very clear, of a map of a recent initiative that is organized by the University of Kent, and some scholars who are interested in the presence of native people in Britain, in England especially, in the 17th century. And this is a map of all the places in London where they know native people have lived. And the map includes data going from the early 17th century all the way up to the end of the 19th century. And it's a wonderful set of stories, but today we're focusing on the 17th century native visitors. Here's another old map of London, which sort of orients this previous map. Let's see if I can get that back. Sorry, going the wrong way. There, whoops. So there is the sort of general map. And if you can access this online if you're interested, and each one of those little locational marks will tell you what native person it was and who they were living with, as far as they know, and when they were there. It's a wonderful resource for teaching and just for general interest. I'm doing this really badly. There's the 17th century image of the city. It shows you how compact it was compared to today. And finally, this is Cornhill, which is where Squanto lived for at least 3 years with the merchant John Slaney. So you can see that he, in his day, was in the heart of commercial and literary and cultural London, and had the opportunity as a result of his associationship with Mr. Slaney, who was also an associate of Sir Ferdinando Gorges and some of the other British entrepreneurs who were sending expeditions to the New World. So I know most of you have been to London, try to picture what this place must have been like in the early 17th century. You know, Shakespeare was still writing, Queen Elizabeth was on the throne for part of this time. This was an exciting and innovative period in England, and here were our renowned native representatives in the thick of it. Another person we have to acknowledge in this story is, of course, Sir Walter Raleigh, who was responsible for missions not only to this part of the world, but to Guyana, and also, of course, to Jamestown. And sadly, this didn't work out all that well for him, but he was also responsible for bringing a number of Native people from the from the coastal Carolinas and further north, and the Guyanan people to England for the same reasons, so that they could learn English, so that they could serve as interpreters and further English colonization efforts. And another one of the associates with whom we have to reckon is John Smith, who also, kind of like popping up in different places, as we know. One of the places was Jamestown, and another one was New England. And each of these individuals was responsible for, or someone sailing for them was responsible for the capture and return of Native people to England. A number of historians have studied this set of visitors to Britain and to Europe based on captures or other kinds of negotiations that people like Smith and Sir Walter Raleigh made with Native peoples, so that we understand a little bit more about how familiar Native people were with the Old World, and more, in some ways, as importantly, how English people and other people from other parts of Europe became familiar with Native Americans long before they ever saw the Americas themselves. John Smith was also responsible for bringing the largest entourage of Native people to Europe. This is Pocahontas, as you know, married to John Rolfe. Excuse me. Arrived in London in 1618, I believe. She brought 40 people with her, all Native people from the Powhatan area of Virginia, but all, I want to point out, speakers of languages related to the languages spoken in New England. These were all Algonquin speakers, and they likely were able to communicate in a basic way, not entirely fluent in each other's languages, but likely to know and understand something about each other's languages. As you probably know, Pocahontas died at Gravesend in 1619, but most of her entourage survived. Some of them stayed in England. Some of them ended up in Bermuda, my husband's area of expertise, and some of them ultimately returned to Virginia. So a large group of people were in England, in London, before the Pilgrims arrived on the Cape. Now, of course, we all know that the Pilgrims were spending, they were in Leiden at the time of the Pocahontas's visit to this area. However, there were, as we all know, so-called strangers associated with the Pilgrim colony who came from London and who were knowledgeable about the whole colonization project, and some of them had been in Virginia. One of these individuals, Stephen Hopkins, turns up in Mort's Relation, and it is clear that he also spent time in Virginia and knew something about Algonquin languages and Algonquin people as a result of his time in Jamestown. Of course, John Smith also had spent time in Jamestown, so there were several people associated with the so-called first encounter here on the Cape who had encountered Native people several times before that. So they were knowledgeable about what Native people spoke, how they trapped and hunted. Stephen Hopkins in particular was evidently quite knowledgeable about hunting practices and so on. And those of you who have read that story closely know that he was one of the people chosen to accompany Edward Winslow on his first visit to Soams, which was Massasoit's, Osamoquin's capital, if you will. Presumably he was one of the people involved because he knew something about the native cultures of the people that they were trying to communicate with and interact with. I have included this. I'm sorry, I just could not get this on the slide completely, and please don't bother to read it. But this isn't, I wanted to put this up here to remind myself. In addition to the people who had actually been in Virginia and been in other places where Algonquin-speaking people lived, there were English observers who had met these people in different contexts. This is part of a letter from John Pori, who was the secretary of the colony of Virginia, was associated with the establishment of Jamestown, and later in his career had occasion to visit Plymouth, and I think he came in 1621. So he's one of the earliest visitors to Plymouth Plantation, who had also been in Jamestown. And one of the things that he mentions in this letter, which you should bother read because it did such a terrible job putting it up there, is that Pori's, in his conversations with other people who had traveled in this region, other English people, probably his own presence in London at crucial periods of time when native people were there, and his experience at Jamestown caused him to begin to make comments about the ways in which the people of New England and the people of Virginia were similar and different. So you could call this one of the first examples of comparative ethnography, even though, of course, that was not his intent. And his comments toward the end of that section show that he knew something about the native languages of the area as well. Any of you who know anything about the history of Jamestown know that Jamestown was a little fort stuck out at the end of a peninsula in the middle of nowhere in 1609. And by the time Pori was there, maybe a little bit more sophisticated than that. All of the people that he spoke to were likely to have been at the fort at Jamestown. So these were native people who were experts in their language, who were explaining this information to Mr. Pori and to others who were interested. This is important to me, because I, as a scholar, am interested in the history of linguistic studies. And John Pori and this gentleman here, Thomas Harriot, who was also a founder of the earlier English colony of Roanoke, were the first generation, if you will, of scholars who recognized that Native American languages formed an entirely different group or type of languages from those that scholars had been studying since the 14th or the 15th centuries, when Europeans were, if you will, allowed to look at exotic languages like Hebrew and Aramaic and so on as a basis of their studies of the Bible and trying to reconstruct the original languages in which the Bible was written. So this scholarship, which was centered in places like Oxford and Cambridge and the Royal Society in London, were all in the midst of a gigantic, if you will, revolution in understanding of languages and language studies. Many historians have written on this, but the point I'm trying to make here is that Native Americans were directly involved in this study. Not only were they language consultants, but it was their understanding of the structure and the grammar of these languages that inspired these scholars to investigate broader aspects of linguistic analysis. If I get this right. I'm sorry, this picture is in here. Should have maybe had it in earlier. This is Scion House, which no longer stands. Excuse me. But this is where Thomas Harriot lived. And while he lived there, there were 3 Native American Algonquin speakers in residence. So even before his time and after his time in Jamestown, or rather what used to be, what now is part of North Carolina, Roanoke, had the opportunity to work daily with speakers of American Indian languages. And as a result of that, and some of his other researches, he developed the first theory, if you will, of the universal structure of languages. And this is a page from his notebooks, which shows the way he was trying to, excuse me, use this linguistic experience he had working with Native Americans, speakers of Algonquin languages, and also some Guianan speakers, excuse me, to think of languages more broadly than had been the case in earlier generations of linguistic scholars. I know this isn't the most exciting topic for, see some people leaving, but for me it's very exciting because linguistics for such a long time has been a field that's been dominated by a very narrow group of academics, if you will, and the contributions that Native people make to those languages and to the studies rather, and the need that Native people have to be able to use this scholarly information in ways that will help languages when they're within their own communities is so great that returning them to the center of the history of linguistic studies is one of the ways to encourage that to happen. I understand parenthetically that that some of the other events associated with this series will be some language workshops run by Jessie Little and some of her other language teachers. So there'll be an opportunity to learn much more about that in the future. Other heirs to this linguistic information that might be familiar to you, and this is sort of the end of this section here, are Roger Williams, of course, who in the 1630s lived with the Narragansett and local tribal members very close to here, and also was the author of a very important study of the Narragansett language, which is still available to scholars today, and also John Eliot, who was the missionary associated with the conversion efforts in this part of the world, with John Printer, who was probably a Nipmuc speaker, and the help of many other Native scholars of their own languages, put together 2 editions of the Bible, the first Bible published in the New World, which was in what we would now call the Wampanoag language. So this tradition of scholarship that goes back to the 16th century has beneficiaries and continuing interest among the American colonies for many, many generations to come. Now, the last part of my talk is going to concern two other issues where Native people made contributions, if you will, to the ethnography of the 17th century English. And that's another way I want to turn the tables. We often think of English people describing Native Americans, but Native Americans also knew quite a bit about English people. And two areas that I want to focus on at the end of this presentation have to do with performance, and the second one has to do with spirituality. We'll start with performance because that's fun. And a lot of research has been done recently on 17th century theater in Britain and the colonies. And again, if you imagine Squanto and some of the other Native people in London at this period, they would have seen many theatrical performances, which happened not only in theaters, but also out on the street. And here we have just an image of 17th century actors and the way that they performed and danced. Why do I, okay. Well, I'll leave that there for a minute. That's a really arresting image, but I just want to say a few more things about performance and theater. Native American greetings to Europeans, which are described in the first encounter narratives, include a number of what you might call ritual expressions. There's also dance, music, food, feasting of various kinds, gift giving, but there's also what you might call theatricals. Let me go back to that picture for a minute. I have another image I want to show you. There it is. This is actually from the early 18th century, but it's an Illinois shaman described by a French explorer. And in this image, which is part of the Gilcrease collections in Tulsa, we see some of the elements of Native American performance which would have been part of what Native people would have probably enacted as a result of their interest in communicating with English people who they knew had the same kind of theatrical presence in a way. Love to tell you more about this image, but the important things to look at are the smoking, tobacco, and the calumet in this case. Sharing tobacco was part of some of the earliest exchanges between Native people and Europeans in this part of the world anyway, where they grew tobacco. The serpent on your left there is meant to be a commentary, if you will, on the transformational nature of shamanic activities, which were meant to allow Native people to enter into other than human spirit worlds, if you will. And the serpent could be an image of that experience, or it could actually be a bodily transformation in some cases. We don't have anywhere near enough time to talk about the complexities of this idea, but the fact that the practitioner there is wearing a tattoo, can you see the turtle on his right thigh there, is another representation of this ability to move back and forth between worlds, which shamans in particular and the use of tobacco were meant to enable. And the fact that Native people used these kinds of rituals in their greetings with Europeans suggests to me, anyway, that these ritual encounters were in part about transforming those strangers into friends. And so we can think about these encounters in terms of Native spirituality as much as we can use other sort of ways of thinking about that. The last thing I have time to talk to you about today, because I think I was only supposed to talk for about 45 minutes, is material culture, which is where a lot of discussions of the first encounters begin. The reason for that is because in the records that we have, there are many comments about gifts that were given from the sachems to the Europeans who arrived, and gifts that the Europeans gave to the Native people that they encountered. So gift giving is obviously a very important part of the story, but also many of the archaeological findings that we have that document the earliest periods of encounters between Europeans and Native peoples are known through archaeological remains. And in particular, and very controversial these days, are interments, which include European objects. And one of the most common of these objects is the copper or the brass kettle, which are ubiquitous in Native North American sites dating back at least to the 14th century. So they were acquiring objects like this way before most Native people encountered a European directly, that they were moving through trade routes down the St. Lawrence. They were being acquired from Native peoples in other parts of the Americas. Could have been acquired from the Spanish or the French. They were very, very common trade items in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. So, so that's why material culture is so important in our discussions of these encounters. But kettles in particular are interesting because from the sort of European point of view, they're utilitarian. They're for carrying things, they're for cooking things. For Native Americans, it appears that they became not only these utilitarian objects, and the metal that they were made of was reminiscent of native copper, so they were familiar in the sense that their materials was something that Native people had encountered before, but that they came to represent a coming together of European and Native American traditions. And they, many archaeologists have speculated recently that they came to be understood to be protective objects, and objects that represented the newfound knowledge of Native people. So it wasn't so much that they were kettles, it's that they had become symbols in their own right of the way in which Native people continued to learn and grow. So it wasn't capitulation or acculturation, as anthropologists used to call it. It was a new sophistication. And that's one of the reasons why we think these kettles turn up in so many contexts, where they weren't obviously utilitarian. They were symbolic, if you will, and ritual in their own way. That's about all I have time to speak to you about today. My hope here is to show that these encounters were encounters that Native people had equal agency in, and that the way in which they taught people about their languages, they taught people about how to give and receive, they taught people about spirituality, and they themselves grew and learned as a result of those encounters, is a different way of telling the encounter story that celebrates equal participation in that story. Thank you very much.
We're open to some questions if there are any folks in the back there. Yeah.
Dr. Braden, I had a question. You mentioned in your introductory remarks Sachem Aspinet,
Yes,
who was the chief here of the Nauset tribe on the Outer Cape.
yes.
Had he had previous association with the English at all?
Yes, he had. Yes. It's not, we don't have any information from him directly, but we know that he was the, if you will, the most prominent Native leader of the region. And if we think of it as a tribal boundary, the leader of the tribal group that really extended from here all the way up to the end of the Cape. And so it has indirect evidence suggests that any encounters with Europeans, any shipwrecks, any opportunities for trade, any attempts at capture, any kinds of hostile encounters, if you will, would be reported directly to him. So one of the reasons, if you want to think of it this way, he sort of suddenly appears in the woods at this encounter was because he knew they were coming. He already knew they were there, and he was biding his time. He was waiting for the right chance, I think. Yeah.
Under what circumstances did the natives go to Europe? Did they volunteer? Or
Some
were
of them
other
probably
things involved?
volunteered. I think Squanto might have volunteered to go back with one of the Newfoundland expeditions. Of course, he had been captured prior to that.
Right, yeah.
So most of them were captives, sorry. Thomas Hunt's, for example, group that I think he was sailing under John Smith, and those people whom he captured, supposedly without permission, were sent to Spain, and most of them died there. But Squanto might have been in that group too. He has a trickster history, I'd say.
So they didn't necessarily go by choice.
Oh, no, I think very rarely did they go by choice. Yeah. Yes.
Boyd's relation kind of talks about encountering buried Europeans, also probably a European fort.
Yeah.
So it sort of suggests that there were, encounters and maybe trading expeditions, fishing expeditions, and Europeans living with Native Americans.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's such an interesting story. Some of those people, it appears, were French captives who had been on another voyage and somehow or other were sent down the Cape, probably to Sachem Aspinet, as captives from the Massachusetts Bay, from Boston area. But I think probably a lot of those people were from expeditions we don't know about, because there were so many people coming over, and not all of those voyages have been recorded. And it's likely that there were impermanent settlements of fishermen or mariners or whoever who had to winter over, or who were exploring or whatever. And we don't know where we come from, but we know they were there because those burials have been found.
Right.
Yeah. Mhm.
I have a question. You showed us the metal, they were like pots or something
Yeah.
like that. And you said, what were the dates on those? Those are pre-Columbian?
Could be,
Okay.
yeah. But some of them are later than that, 15th and 16th century. I mean, they were,
But some of them might have been
Ubiquitous.
there before.
yes. Mhm. And in fact, there are some sites in Iroquois, if you will, sort of upper New York State along the St. Lawrence River, where some of those sites are early 15th century, possibly late 14th century. And sometimes they took those kettles, obviously, and broke them up and made other things with them. But they can tell nowadays with sophisticated kinds of analysis, which copper is native and which comes from European sources. So they can see the spread of European copper items through the Northeast anyway, for several centuries. Yes?
You mentioned that the Native Americans were elusive.
Yeah.
Is that because they were well aware that they could have been captured?
That is what some people told the Pilgrims when they got here. They said that children of theirs, I think, they met one woman who had had 3 sons who had been captured and taken away and never seen again. So yes, that must have been a reason that they were staying away. I think they were also deciding on their best strategy. They were in obvious communication with one another, because why else would Samoset show up all of a sudden? And why did it take so long for Massasoit to make his presence known? They were planning their strategy in the same way that the Pilgrims were planning their strategy, I suppose. That would be my guess. Yes.
Do you know the dates that Squanto was in London, and is it possible that he saw Shakespeare plays?
It's totally possible. He also, and many other Native people, sorry for getting so close to this, were, if you will, presented at the court of James I. And James was very fond of theatricals. So it's entirely likely that they observed English drama of that same period. As far as the dates when Squanto was there, it's really hard to say, because they were there in London anytime between the 1580s and in Squanto's case, he died in what, I think 1622, something like that. So it must have been sometime in the very beginning of the 17th century. Yes?
Do 2 more questions?
Yes, sir.
2 quick questions. One, is there some time period where all of these kind of random expeditions gave a general realization in England or Europe that there were communities of humans over here? And
Yeah, for people,
the
sorry.
second one was, what did the Native Americans think of the Europeans?
Okay, so the first question is, when did people, Europeans generally become aware of the presence of Native Americans? At least by Columbus's time, so beginning of the 15th century, but probably much earlier than that as well. The second question again was, sorry,
What did the Native
what did
Americans-
Native Americans think about Europeans? I was going to include a quote from Roger Williams on that. The Narragansetts had a theory about Europeans. They thought the English were the best traders. They thought the French were easy to deceive. And they thought that, they said in their own language, the Spanish were dogs. Well, I don't know what that means, but yes, they had many, many opinions about Europeans.
Okay, I see two more hands, so we'll do those. Go ahead, sir.
Oh, was there any chance that the natives realized that their numbers were decimated by diseases? And was that one of the reasons they stayed away?
That's a good comment. As many of you probably know, a terrible disease swept through southern New England in 1618 and 1619. And Thomas Morton, who lived closer to what's now Boston, said that he thought at least 9 out of 10 people died as a result of that epidemic. So the Boston, Massachusetts Bay region was heavily impacted by these diseases, but whether they knew, I mean, if they understood germ theory the way we do today is obviously debatable. But certainly, if it were me and 9 out of 10 people in my family had died as a result of the arrival of Europeans, I would have been wary. Yeah. Yes.
Your current research on the Wampanoag, will you be publishing that?
Yes. Eventually.
In book form, or?
I hope another book. Yeah, and then
The
the usual.
Wampanoag friends, and I go to powwow, I'm really interested in that kind of thing.
The Wampanoags are the most generous people on earth, and without them I would be less than nothing. They help me with everything that I do, and they are very kind to share their information with me.
All right. Thank you very much.